Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's event. My name is Christoph Lindner. I'm the Dean of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment here at University College London. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which is hosted and organized by Places Journal and the Bartlett. And we're really excited to be doing something together. We have an amazing, fascinating panel of experts from lots of different universities, and we want to get them talking about our topic this evening. So we're going to jump into the conversation just as quickly as we can. Our topic today is to investigate, to think about the relationship between climate change adaptation and social justice. And as we all know, climate change is exacerbating existing inequalities in the world, and it's also producing new ones. So thinking about the ways in which the built environment both contributes to, but also can help us overcome those inequalities as they are produced by climate change is really a key concern for us. So I'm going to introduce each of our speakers, and we've asked each of them just to say a few words responding to the topic of climate change adaptation and social justice. And after we've met all of our speakers, we will open this up to a panel-wide discussion. And I would also like to let you know that we're really happy to take questions from our audience. And if you click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as we go along this evening, I'll be able to see your questions and I'll try to pick those up and feed them into our conversation. So let me begin by introducing our first speaker, who is Lizzie Yarina, and she is a doctoral candidate at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and she's also a research fellow at MIT's Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. Lizzie.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be a part of this conversation. Before beginning my PhD, I had a small grant from the MIT SUTV collaboration, which eventually became an article for Places Journal to look at climate adaptation in 4 cities in Southeast Asia. And when climate vulnerability is spoken about in this region, it's often in regards to the urban poor. Think of images of those already in substandard housing with wet feet. But the resilience projects being proposed, invariably including high-rise construction, seem to be for a different group of people entirely. And digging a little deeper, I found that many informal riverbank communities were being actively demolished to make way for so-called resilient architecture and urbanism from Ho Chi Minh City to Bangkok. And so I found myself asking, who was resilience really for? I'd recently finished my master's of architecture, and that was my primary background. And in the process of researching the article, I found that a conventional architecture education hadn't really prepared me that well for answering questions about the equity impacts of adaptation interventions, and a lot of the other questions I think we're going to be talking about on the panel tonight. So in spite of how design and engineering firms like to talk about their proposals, climate adaptation projects are never win-win scenarios. Adaptation is never a strictly technical mitigation of a hazard. It's also an enforcement of a particular vision of the future and a foreclosure of others. Adaptation projects are negotiations over competing priorities, some of which have nothing to do with resilience at all. So in that article for Places, I proposed the idea of competing imaginaries of resilience to highlight how different groups, from government officials to experts in design and engineering to those living in flood-prone communities, might conceive of climate adaptive futures differently and in ways that might even be at odds. So in 2019, I began a PhD in urban planning at MIT, in part because I wanted to learn more about how adaptation negotiates questions of spatial equity. And I see there's a really strong spatial dimension to that. I'm focusing in part on Vietnam's Mekong Delta, which throws many of the trade-offs and externalities of adaptation plans into stark relief, trade-offs that are socioeconomic, spatial, and temporal. These range from shrimp farmers breaking down salinity control barriers designed to protect rice production as sea levels rise, to how upstream dikes designed to protect urban settlements can worsen flooding downstream. So coming from architecture, I'm interested in how the models that designers, engineers, and other experts use to attempt to negotiate these trade-offs, because ultimately the spatial disciplines do have a key role to play in the response to climate change and to climate change adaptation. After all, as Mary Heglar says in a recent article, to build a better world, you first have to imagine it. And that's part of what we're trained to do as designers. But we also need to understand the limitations and externalities of our models. Adaptation is social and political, and there's more than one imaginary of what it can or should look like. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that was not too long. So thanks again, and looking forward to what everyone else has to say.
Thank you, Lizzie. And our next speaker is Keel Mo, who is a practicing architect and also a visiting professor at the University of Minnesota.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I, in particular, enjoy this format, so I'm looking forward to a somewhat relaxed but hopefully intense conversation about this important topic. I'm an architect and a builder, one who focuses on the energetics of architecture and building, which is much less about the fuel efficiency of buildings, as it might be familiar to us, but rather the larger terrestrial dynamics of building and urbanization by using a systems ecology framework to redescribe what all architecture is and does on the thin surface of this planet as we use it to reorganize nature and society. And as I map out this physical constitution of the material energy flows that go into building, that map quickly becomes a pretty sound map of the social and political relations of those material energy exchanges that occur between the extractive zones of this planet that always end up somehow underdeveloped, while the concentrating core of global capitals are arguably overdeveloped. So this uses, systems ecology, various forms of ecological analysis, but it also gets into various world systems, form of social and political analysis, for example, using unequal ecological and economic exchange and environmental load displacement frameworks to help better describe what building and urbanization are doing. I'm halfway through a 4-book series that uses this framework, and each book is basically using an iconic building from Manhattan every 25 years to kind of chart this transformation of building in the 20th and 21st century. I'm also active practicing builder. I build timber buildings in rural contexts. I'm very interested in rurality and in this case, the extractive zones of, I live and work in the extractive zones of timber building. So I feel it's very important to be doing as much field work as lab or seminar work for these topics, because I think it's important to have an immediate sense of what's going on out there. And I feel like as many possible conclusions or responses are going to occur out there as on a university campus. So happy to be here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Keel. And next is Brett Milligan, who is a professor of landscape architecture and environmental design at UC Davis.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Let's see, a bit about me. Much of my design work concerns climate adaptation of landscapes. For me, landscapes are never static or passive scenery. I view landscapes as very complex, dynamic things that are constantly changing, constantly evolving, constantly moving, which I've talked about in a Places article called the landscape migration. So I'm myself a very keen observer of landscape dynamics. And find that to me, that is where a lot of opportunity is to catalyze more beneficial and equitable change, and where I like to work. A large portion of my work is focused on the interface between land and water, such as estuaries, bays, deltas, and rivers, where so many of the past things we designed or engineered have failed. Were not very equitable, either ecologically or socially. And so a lot of my work is trying to undo some of that. A lot of it falls under the name of reclamation, which was basically the taking of these watery edges and turning them into terrestrial territories for, basically a way of colonizing them. And specifically, I do a lot of thinking and designing in California's Bay Delta, working on large-scale restoration projects to redesign and reclaim tidal marshes, to rethink flood control, and to remake multifunctional floodplains. I also think more and more about proactive retreat as perhaps our most adaptive, most equitable response when we are thinking about climate change in longer time horizons of just increasing stress that's going to be put on the settlements we've put in places where maybe they shouldn't be. Many of the projects I engage in are complex and controversial, particularly in California's Delta, which is the central hub for California's water system, which is a ginormous ecological overtaxed infrastructure built on a lot of premises that never really existed. And that's where I help lead transdisciplinary design efforts for multi-benefit projects, trying to envision futures that might be better than the status quo we're headed towards, which is not a good one. And I like this work because it's quite difficult. I think we are today asking landscapes to do seemingly impossible things to address disparate stakeholder and public interests that can seem mutually exclusive. I also like working in California because prior to climate change, we kind of have the most volatile climate in the US. We're subject to droughts and atmospheric rivers and things like that. It's a very extreme climate to work in. But within that, I hold to this idea of the plasticity of landscape and its capacity to accommodate diversity. So much of what we did over the past 2 centuries was to homogenize and simplify landscapes, whether we're talking agricultural monocultures or seawalls or all these things that were basically trying to simplify and control a very complex medium. And so much of what I'm trying to do is to try to bring back some of that exuberant richness. And I will contend that I think actually diversifying landscape form is a way to deal with, to address societal and ecological diversity. And I see that as a challenge and learning process that I try to engage in. Thanks.
Thank you, Brett. Our next speaker is Danielle Zoe Rivera, who is an assistant professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning at the University of California, Berkeley.
Hi, thank you for having me. I just wanted to make a few remarks and discuss, how these reflect on the work that we're doing in my lab at Berkeley, which is the Just Environments Lab. And so my background in all of this, as an urban designer and planner comes from an environmental justice perspective. And so as environmental justice scholars and activists, we've historically focused on the inequitable distribution of environmental bads in the environment, things like point sources of pollution or locally unwanted land uses like LULUs, and green infrastructure, tree planting, stormwater management, parks. These have all been methods that are promoted as the means and tools for addressing this inequitable distribution of environmental bads. However, what we're increasingly finding is that these methods are actually reproducing the inequalities that we were intending to address at the first place. And so people want to live by environmental amenities. So anytime we install a park or trees or green infrastructure, especially in low-income communities, what we're seeing is that they become the precedents of gentrification and become the sort of catalyst of change because we install park, home values increase around the park, and then that leads to the displacement of the very communities that we hope to assist. And so this inability to access environmental goods is increasingly being recognized as another form of environmental injustice. I think of the work of Julian Gaiman. His work on just sustainability notes that oppressed communities oftentimes lack sufficient access to and comfort using environmental goods. And this is a huge issue that I'm seeing in my own work. And then more recently, Isabel Angelovsky also describes this concept as green gentrification. Elsewhere, it's been referred to as environmental or ecological gentrification, whereby, as Angelovsky says, waste sites evolve into wastable places, producing new geographies of environmental injustices. And this is something I've been very concerned with in my work. But seeing this concern sort of at a environmental justice level, which is oftentimes hyper-local or at least hyper-regional, but we tend to not go beyond that, understanding that disasters and climate change are exacerbating these very issues. And so what we're seeing is many environmental justice scholars starting to work at a much larger level. And we understand that issues like disasters and climate change will take point sources of pollution and other LULUs and exacerbate them as well. And so the very same communities that we've seen experience environmental injustices over many, many decades, generations, are now at heightened risk of disasters and climate change. But when we attempt to adapt to climate change or to address disasters through post-disaster construction or pre-disaster projects like increasing resilience of communities, oftentimes what we see is the same results that we got when we tried green infrastructure strategies. And this phenomena has been referred to increasingly as disaster gentrification or low carbon gentrification. And so this is really what I've been trying to understand and focus on. I think as professionals focus on the built environment, as landscape architects, architects and planners, we need to ask ourselves how we can overcome this seeming conundrum. We want to improve the environment. We want to improve the lives of people in all kinds of communities, but how do we do that? And so my research lab at Berkeley, the Just Environments Lab, has been trying to really support and reflect upon this. We're working with low-income communities and their leaders, mainly in South Texas and Puerto Rico right now, but we're also starting to expand into California to identify ways to improve the physical environment of these communities without displacing them. And what we've learned so far is from these communities and their leaders is that we need to unearth the true issues underlying why they're exposed to environmental bads at higher rates from the outset. Issues like racism, patriarchy, xenophobia, colonialism, all of these things are what we're hearing from the communities in Puerto Rico and South Texas. And so without addressing these concerns, what we found is that our physical interventions to address disaster and to address climate change will actually perpetuate the inequalities that these communities have been facing. So, and essentially what we're finding is that it is really in our policies and procedures surrounding our responses to climate change and to disaster where we really need to be focusing. So alongside physical interventions, such as the actual reconstruction of a community, what we're after disaster, what we're also looking at is how there also needs to be a focus on policies and procedures that goes alongside those physical interventions and trying to develop that as a strategy going forward. So I'll leave it there for now. I'm so excited to talk about this more, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle. And just as a small aside, I want to share, I'm really enjoying these short intros because we're already hearing a lot of provocative ideas, as well as some really sharp insights. So we'll try and pick up on some of the ideas that you're already sharing as we get into the conversation. Our next guest is Dusty Gedge, who is UCL's Green Infrastructure Industry Expert in Residence. He's also the president of the European Federation of Green Roof and Wall Associations, director of Green Infrastructure Consultancy, and founding director of livingroofs.org. Welcome, Dusty. And you might be on mute.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Christoph. You've given me a good enough introduction, but I started off as an environmental activism to make policy in London. And I don't come from the built environment educationally, but now I'm a relatively recognised person when it comes to green roofs. And I want to cut to the quick, and I think Danielle has summed it up quite succinctly. I have some very good friends in Portland, Oregon, who say where there is pavement, there's poverty. Where there's leafiness, there is suburbia. And where there's tarmac, there's generally more air pollution. And particularly, not necessarily in the United Kingdom, but certainly we've got a lot of people from North America here, where you have high urban heat island effect in cities, where there's lots of concrete and lots of pavement, that's where you can get a lot of pollution issues. And as the climate gets hotter, areas of poverty are likely to actually suffer more. So the links to my work with green infrastructure, whether it be at roof or ground level, is the more green infrastructure, the better the environment. But as Danielle has said, generally that can lead to gentrification. And certainly when we look to retrofit a city like London, you know, we need to be looking at economic mechanisms to target areas which are actually poorer and actually have less green space. And my final thing is, I think we might have to change how we view things. We always look at products and we look at anything that needs to be maintained as a burden. And actually, if we look at how we adapt to climate change, we need to change this idea of maintenance to stewardship. And in terms of stewardship, that it can create employment and people can then be able to engage in that who may be at a lower income level. So I'm going to round off there because, as Christoph said, there's a lot of interesting things being raised so far. So I've kept it nice and short, I hope.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Dusty. And our final speaker is Scott Allen Orr, who is a lecturer in heritage data science at UCL's Institute for Sustainable Heritage, which is part of the Bartlett. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Before I start, I just wanted to give a brief overview, and I found it really interesting that Lizzie pointed out that they felt ill-equipped at one point from their background to talk about these in a very complex way. And I too came to this subject originally as a physical scientist, dealing with engineering in the built environment as a very infrastructural, service-based, metric-based approach. Having then spent some time in a geography faculty before then joining the Bartlett has really helped me. And here within the Institute for Sustainable Heritage, we basically take a value-based approach broadly within the Institute, but also within the heritage sector. And what by value, I don't just mean economic value, but also looking at the things that are more difficult to quantify, and that presents a problem for climate adaptation, things like cultural value, social value. And crucially, although heritage, especially in the UK context, or perhaps better known in the American context as the historic preservation, or historic assets, we're not just talking about the historic built environment here, but broadly anything which is valued. So both tangible aspects of heritage, but also intangible aspects. So most of my research looks at physical impacts on the historic built environment, but through this I become involved with a number of policy initiatives on climate change and heritage. So in December, there's a meeting being convened by the International Council on Monuments and Sites, co-sponsored by the IPCC and UNESCO, basically looking at culture, heritage, and climate change in a very broad sense. And in preparation for this, they've commissioned 3 white papers to basically set up the conversation of about 100 selected world experts on this topic. The 3 papers are looking at impacts and risks. That's one that I'm working on, which is perhaps the most obvious and engineering infrastructural-based way of thinking about heritage and climate change, but the other 2 are looking at adaptation and mitigation. And so really brilliant to hear the ideas already being proposed that these are assets that need to be stewarded and have a role in climate adaptation. They are not something which are a burden or fragile, but actually have a role in trying to tackle some of these issues of social justice. And the final one looking at diverse knowledge systems. So actually turning on its head how we actually determine what is valued, assumptions we might be making on a global scale, and trying to look at diverse perspectives on important aspects of the built environment, of the natural environment, and how society views its relationship with the environment in a heritage context. So thanks very much, Christoph. Looking forward to this.
Wonderful. So you've met all of our panelists, and it's time to start moving towards having a group conversation, perhaps even a group debate. Just an invitation to all of our audience who are joining us online. We're very happy to pick up your questions and your comments. And if you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, click on that. Please feel free to type in your thoughts, and we can pick those up as we go through the conversation. Now, I have, of course, a few prepared questions that I have been planning to put to our panel, but listening to your introductions, I want to begin with something that's a little unprepared. So last week, I actually happened to be in Madrid at the Norman Foster Foundation, where we were participating in a workshop on sustainability. And one of the ideas that we were discussing there, and I really am curious what you think on this panel, is the claim that climate change is fundamentally a design problem. And I wonder to what extent you would agree, contest, or complicate that kind of statement. Who'd like to jump in?
Oh, I'll do it.
Thank you, Brett.
Yeah, I fully agree that we sort of designed our way into what this is. I mean, I think there's definitely some nice scholarship out there that, you know, the world is largely a designed thing at this point. Everything in our lives in the daily existence is designed, whether it's buildings in cities, whether it's the rural landscape, like pretty much everything we've surrounded ourselves with at this point has some human fingers all over it. And I think it's also quite a challenge for us to think about ourselves as designers, because if you look to the past of what we've done, the effects of what we've done, a lot of it is inadvertently or unintentionally bad, as well as the sort of deliberate colonial aspects of that. But I think it really puts the challenge in perspective of so much of what we've tried to do to sort of, you know, betterment of the environment has failed. And we have sort of, you know, changed the climate through, you know, ideas of trying to make our lives better and more convenient. And it is a thoroughly designed problem, I would say.
Okay. Yes, Lizzie.
Maybe what I want to do is kind of complicate of the options you gave to kind of complicate the claim. And I think the risk of framing climate change as a design problem is that it suggests that there are certain people who have the tools as designers or experts to do so in a kind of top-down way that kind of takes the power over those decisions, maybe from some of the people who are experiencing the worst effects of the climate crisis, and maybe those who are least responsible for it. And so I wouldn't necessarily disagree, but I think we would have to be careful in terms of how we define design and who gets to have a say on what it is and what is a good designed outcome and what is a bad design outcome, because I don't think those are going to be the same, even if they're all purportedly addressing the climate crisis.
That makes me think of COP26, which is coming up later this week in Glasgow, where obviously a lot of the discussion there is going to be political, but bringing in lots of different voices. But it makes me think of the importance of voices, of a multiplicity of voices in this kind of conversation. And I'm wondering if we think of climate change as a design problem or a challenge that design has the power to transform, what would you see then as the relationship between activism and design? Because one of the things that's really struck me over the last few years is the way in which youth activism and grassroots activism and community activism have created so much momentum around climate change as a topic of urgency, of crisis, and how that has mobilized and entered into politics. Yeah, Danielle.
Yeah, I think building on what Lizzie was, just saying, because I agree with her perspective. I think climate change is certainly a spatial issue. It's a physical issue related to, the space of the Earth. But I think to say it's a design issue simplifies it too much. I think at least design in the sense that we've thought of it in the past, design as, sort of a product that we are delivering, and not as, I think, Brian Lee puts it, as collective aspirations, as a model that we're trying to move towards to address, social justice issues and climate change. So design as collective aspiration being more of what we're talking about, which is, designer as a facilitator, facilitating a conversation about the spaces that we live in. And I think that's such a powerful framework. And so if we shift I guess my answer is, if we can shift our focus in design away from products and more towards this idea of a collective aspiration, as Lee puts it, I think we could potentially, place ourselves in a position to really address the issue. But if we continue with this framework of a design as a product, I don't think we're going to get to some of the more systemic issues that I think Brett was mentioning are sort of part and parcel of how designers think about the world, which has led to, contributed to the issue of climate change. So I think there's a paradigmatic shift that needs to happen in design for us to actually be able to address the issue.
And do we feel that that paradigmatic shift is already happening within the design professions and the design disciplines? Certainly, it seems that outside of design, there's a view of design as a kind of product-oriented and outcome-oriented process. But what you're suggesting, Danielle, is much more nuanced, much more participatory, much more collective, much more utopian. To me, it's a much more compelling vision of design. But is that in your experience where the paradigm is headed currently?
For me personally, no. I see, certain, I mean, if we're talking about schools of architecture and design, certain schools are starting to promote this and have for a very long time. But I think we're still, at our core as scholars and as instructors, still teaching the old model. And I think I see individuals who are trying to push themselves to ask what design might look like if we were to try and aspire to this new model. But I don't think as a sort of profession or set of professions we're heading that direction.
Okay, so I don't want to overinterpret what you're saying, but I sort of hear in there maybe a bit of an invitation or a call for us as part of thinking about how to approach climate change. We also need to think about how we need to transform design education and design research to better equip ourselves for that challenge. And this connects to a question that's been placed in the chat here. So I'm happy to bring in a question from one of our audience members, because it's a little bit a question that touches on who is constructing the field of design, and through that, who is constructing some of the problems that we face in the world, including with climate change. So the question is this: if design is a product of humans, and much of design thinking has been dominated by Eurocentric modalities, then isn't climate change fundamentally a problem of biased or colonial design approaches? Who might like to begin to respond to that one? That's a big question. So to what extent do we link some of the problems we face in the world with climate change to the history of coloniality and the way in which that history has also shaped the discipline and profession of design, as well as the world?
Yeah, I think that sort of continues on what we've been talking about, and I fully agree with Danielle and Lizzie about, when I mentioned that, yeah, it is a design problem. I was kind of referring to design in the way that they defined it as well, as this kind of capital D design versus, other forms of design, more democratic or more participatory. But I think the question there too starts to really get a little bit more at maybe about agency, the have-nots and coloniality. That I think that's a tricky question, which also gets at the upcoming conference, right? Of who. It's really hard to parse who has done what. And, there are really, really differential power dynamics there and different values being exerted upon other people. And I don't know how we can get away from the coloniality of that. I mean, that's sort of what we've been coming from. So I do think the colonial aspect of that is central to what we're talking about. And also back to this complicated notion of climate change as a design problem. Coloniality is fully baked into that, and all of these asymmetric power relationships as well. So,
can I add to that, if I may?
Please do, Dusty.
Yeah, it's slightly parallel to this, because obviously colonialism was partly driven, European colonialism, by fossil fuel, and one of the issues about design is we're still sort of, we want to adapt to climate change, but we're still actually delivering things from a culture of fossil fuels and lots of energy. And so, it's part and parcel of a fossil fuel culture of how we've all been educated to how we design. So it's partly doesn't address that colonial issue, but the big drive colonialism really started to happen when coal and steam was functioning. Colonialism started before that, but that's what started to dominate the world in terms of how we built cities all over the world. It's based upon being able to have energy endlessly by burning fossil fuels. And I don't think we talk about that enough, is that we have to change all of our thinking, because our thinking is based upon a fossil fuel thinking culture.
If I could follow up quickly, I think what's really interesting in the heritage context is that when we think about what matters and what should be, what values and what is preserved, that immediately we can see globally there is still a dominance of a Western perspective, which is that physical things and material things matter. They should be protected, they should be curated. And that is actually a Eurocentric view of what is valued by communities, especially from a top-down perspective. Things like the UNESCO World Heritage Site Program have that embedded in them. Whereas when you look at diverse communities and different values, that perspective is entirely different. And only in about the past 20 or 30 years have we seen at the international level policy engaging with things like the importance of intangible heritage, where the focus is on traditional skills and on communities and on practices rather than the tangible representations of them. And I think as well what's really interesting there is that evidence and what constitutes evidence is also completely rooted in this, that what constitutes knowledge and what can be used in decision-making processes, especially when they are formal decision-making processes. And I'm thinking about heritage examples, but I'm sure they extend to all the kinds of scenarios that people here have already mentioned, is completely different. And it is I don't have an answer for how we address it, though.
Well, let me put you a little bit on the spot, though, Scott, because I find that really fascinating. So would you suggest then that in addition to the forms of climate change adaptation that we more conventionally think about, how do we adjust a coastal area? How do we make, flood friendly architecture? How do we do all those physical material changes that allow us to adapt to climate change? So we also need to be thinking about intangible climate change adaptation. And what would that look like? So what would be some of the things that we would need to ensure that we adapt in order to respond to climate change that are maybe cultural, that are value-based, that are intangible?
That's a very good question. Some of the things that come to mind are, for example, just in the essence of what is being maintained and how, and thinking about traditional knowledge and traditional ways of living, not just in documenting them for the purpose of archiving them and putting them somewhere, but actually trying to identify through community engagement which of those are important and which of those are sustainable to be preserved and which ones need to be documented in other ways, as one example that comes to mind. I think I answered that.
Yeah, and it seems to me that connects to a point that came up earlier around gentrification, and I think it was Danielle who made it. Asking the question, how do we uncouple this really problematic dynamic whereby contributions, climate adaptive contributions to a community that bring more green, that bring more public space, that remove inequalities, have the effect of actually accelerating gentrification or creating the conditions for gentrification. So if the very communities that are being displaced by gentrification are also the ones whose cultures and values and knowledge are under threat, it seems like there's a lot that can go wrong in this scenario if we don't adapt well. So do we have thoughts then about this link between gentrification and climate change adaptation? How do we break that link?
Yeah, I can just jump in very quickly to say that I think this issue of gentrification and displacement when we are trying to help communities is precisely why we need to shift our focus in design away from this product-based notion to that idea of collective aspirations I mentioned earlier. Because if we don't have that collective input from communities, we don't understand their concerns, and not just their concerns right now, but also into the past, thinking historically what's happened in that community, but also looking at what they foresee happening in the future and really taking that under serious consideration in our design processes, then we we aren't going to be able to actually capture what it is that they're experiencing and dealing with. And to me, that's a whole piece of addressing climate change, is not just the physical issues, but also these social issues, the community-based issues as well. So I think these need to be tied together, and that's where I think also policy comes in as well, that as designers, we need to start thinking more about policy. I know my students hate that, but we really do need to start doing that, because if we don't, we may work with communities, I've seen this before, work with communities, come up with interesting and innovative approaches to dealing with the issue of climate change or with environmental injustice. But then there is a policy out there that is predominantly or primarily racist or, misogynist in some way, and that's going to interrupt your ability to actually have an equitable outcome. So I'll leave it. I can rant more about that.
If I could follow up on that, Danielle, if I may, is that I was going to say earlier when you spoke, it's not a design issue. It's having good policies, and those policies should include the people. Generally, a lot of policies, certainly what I see at a European level and at a UK level, we get all the design experts in to tell us how we're going to do this and make policies which are policies that are designed by those people. But policy starts it, and policy has to start this, and then designers have to respond positively to what those policies are.
So we've been talking in quite general and conceptual terms about climate change mitigation. And we have an audience member who's wondering if some members of the panel could point to some models of climate change adaptation that they think promote or help to create equity. So do you have any positive examples in the world that you might draw our attention to? Lizzie.
Yeah, I think, well, the longer I'm in a PhD program, the harder I find it to have good examples. But I think I wanted to mention one case that I looked at with the Urban Risk Lab and in a piece with Mijo Mazareo and Larissa Ovalles, a case in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where a coalition of 8 communities that were exposed to flooding came together to propose a plan for managed retreat, but it was an in-community managed retreat plan because they were recognizing at the same time that they were being exposed to flood hazards, that they were also kind of at risk of being displaced in order for their area to be gentrified, a primarily informal community of San Juan, El Caño Martín Peña in San Juan. And so I think what's interesting about that case is that they kind of reframe some of the rules of the game by creating a community land trust at the level of the territory. So they changed some of the ownership models around how land was managed and used that to create green infrastructure along the channel, which is the community is located. And they did do managed retreat. I'm always very nervous when people suggest managed retreat as a solution, because I'm always asking who's getting to decide whose retreats, where are they going? And so that's one case I would suggest looking at. The project is managed by a group called Enlace, Proyecto Enlace, public corporation.
Fantastic. So we have one example we can go and check out. Any other examples anyone would share? I think we can think of lots of bad ones, but do we have any good ones or complex ones that have the potential to make positive transformation?
I mean, I think I'd like to speak to retreat, because I think retreat often is really put to the side, and I think it's unavoidable, and there are major equity issues around that. And I wish I could, there's a couple projects I know of, but they're escaping me right now because it is morning here in California. But there have been some where, I mean, there are many disadvantaged, vulnerable communities that want to move. And know that they're tired of rebuilding. They're tired of being flooded out. And there are examples where those communities where the major problem is we're like, oh, just go. And they split, right? Nobody wants to do that. There are a few examples, very few, of where entire communities have been able to relocate together so that they don't lose their community. Not that there's not hardship in that, but there is collective will to move, and they're basically advocating for themselves to move and finding the money to move and to go to other places. I feel like we have so few examples of that, and that is going to be a huge part of our future that's going to be necessary, because there's just not the money or the ability to keep a lot of these communities in harm's way. That's only going to get more harmful. So I wish I had the names for those projects, but they're ones that I think very much like Lizzie was talking about, by the community for that community, and actually was able to keep them together rather than them just going off and being isolated.
So while you were speaking, Brett, two words came into my mind. You were talking about retreat, and that's something that's come up a few times already. And another word that's come up is displacement. And one way or another, we're going to see a lot of both of those things over the coming decades, probably, right? So even under the best circumstances, with the most adaptive and just transitions possible to climate change, we're going to see a lot of displacement of people and communities. And I wonder if there's a question of scale that we need to be thinking about. So I can think, of some of those small villages on islands or in Scandinavia that get to be, that can be moved around and the communities can stay together. But what do we do when whole cities of millions of people need to retreat and need to move? And how do we ensure that it is a movement that's happening together rather than a forced displacement? So just to pick, and I apologize if this sounds targeted, but just to pick a city like Miami, that's something very much on my mind. What do you do if you have to manage the retreat of Miami? Is there a way to do that sustainably and justly? And that's for the whole group. If anyone wants, that's not necessarily just for Brett.
Well, what?
Yeah, I'm not gonna be able to answer that. I'll just throw one other piece in there that I feel like we haven't talked much about time in our conversation so far, and you're talking about scales. I think it's the time scales that it's only then that retreat makes sense in any sense, right? It's only when you look 30, 40 years in the future, like all our plans are like, to 20 to 30 years out. It's only gonna get worse beyond there. It's not like we're just gonna correct the problem and the seas are gonna go down. So I think with any of these discussions about retreat, they only really make sense if you project 60, 70 years, as you go forward, what these conditions are going to be like, where then what seems far-fetched becomes absolute necessity. So I think if we're going to talk about scales and the scales of it, it's also, I think, really taking into consideration time, projecting forward and also backward, as was mentioned earlier, but really thinking about or being fluid about how we are thinking about time.
I think it's been a couple of decades since I was on a panel with some climate scientists, and they're basically quizzing me on what designers, architects, planners, landscape architects are doing in terms of climate change. And I was just describing some of the tropes at that point, whether it was sustainability, resilience, or the kind of neoliberal tropes that dominate research and pedagogy. And they just laughed. They said, you need to be imagining how to move 4 million people in the space of a few days, right? So I think the question of scale and time is absolutely essential to this. And the fact that we have a group of respectable design researchers here, and we can't come up with projects or precedents for how to do this or act on it, I think is really telling. I think it tells us that I think our research questions, I'm hearing a lot of great frameworks and approaches there, but my sense is that maybe our pedagogies are way, way off. They're nowhere near commensurate with the kind of scale of issues and opportunities that I'm hearing in these discussions. I think our pedagogies remain a kind of 19th century construct, whether it's the academic calendar or the content of the courses, the kind of fetishization of design studios, the fact that all knowledge can only be produced and reproduced on a university campus, et cetera, I think is endemic of a lot of the kind of gaps in knowledge and blind spots that we have as a discipline. It makes me wonder if design is in fact the right way to be thinking through these topics. I mean, design has a role, but I don't know if it's solely a design-based problem. I think, as other people have said, policy is so important, but I think the bigger point, maybe Dusty mentioned it, that it's just a fundamental change. Everything has to change in really radical ways. The kind of slight tweaks to our practices or to our pedagogies just certainly are not enough. The kind of future of current students, their lives and careers are going to be absolutely unlike what shaped our own lives and careers, and I think it's time to address that as researchers and educators.
I think you've just said a brilliant thing there. That's key. Changing how we learn and research.
So clearly it's a design problem. Sorry, go ahead, Lizzie.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say clearly we have a design problem. Design.
Yeah, maybe this relates to that. I was going to build on that idea in terms of, I mean, in the context of trying to relocate communities, at least in the US, part of the reason that it's been very difficult to do is because of the governance framework in which that can happen here. And there's really very limited ways to move a group of people together. And a lot of people that have tried to move as a group in the US as a result of climate-linked issues are indigenous communities and historically Black communities who have found it very hard to find actually, even to get land that people would allow them to move into. And then if you get that into the kind of frameworks, this is very US specific, but the frameworks of FEMA and HUD, the way that they support people moving out of harm's way is through buyouts. It's really a market-based kind of non-design strategy, right? It's give you money if you want it. There are some kind of more spatial dimensions to it. But so I don't think we can answer the question of, how do we think about the retreat of Miami without talking about, not only the kind of spatial design, but also the kind of spatial policy dimensions of how would that even be possible and what frameworks would we have to think about differently in order to do that and do that in an equitable way, which is I think, even a more difficult problem to solve.
So I'd just like to mention a book I read recently, and I imagine a number of people in the audience and maybe some of the panel have come across it too. But it's one that I just found really, really insightful, Form and Flow by Kian Go, who's an urban planner at UCLA. And one of the things that she looks at in that, oh, there you go. See, it's everywhere. It's a fantastic book, highly recommend it. And one of the things that really to me was very powerful about that book is the way that she argues that design is a really important space for debating, contesting our imagination of a resilient, just future. So right now we don't have the examples to point to, but in order to have the ability in the future to scale up and deliver over time, we have to begin imagining how we're going to do that. And through that imagination, work out the spatial politics of what's involved. And I think that's another job that design has to do. So let me connect that plug for a book I really admire to a question from a member of our audience. And I think there is a connection here because we've been talking about scale and time. And we have a member of the audience who's wondering, is there also a case to be made for scaling back or scaling down? Things like consumption, the amount of building we're doing, to ease off the pressure that's building up. So is it worth thinking about that side of things?
I think it's really interesting when we talk about heritage. One of the things that I mentioned in my introduction, one of the most common manifestations of that is existing architecture, existing building. And I think one of the challenges is that they're often perceived as performing inadequately compared to their modern contemporaries, also that they are unfit for the future or unadaptable. And I mean that both in a physical sense, but also in a social or cultural sense. And so I think one of the things that's interesting there is that it's clearly not that the buildings have changed, it's that expectations have changed. And part of this is the idea of scaling back. And the problem is, I think, is that it's much harder to convince people of that. You know, one of the examples that I like to give in a heritage context for this is even when you have an informed decision to make, even when you know the technical information against the social or cultural context, often we choose the social or cultural motivated decision. The example I like to give here is a very tangible one of energy retrofit. And we look at windows, for example. We know that double, triple glazed windows are better for this purpose. People will still choose to preserve original windows if they have the choice in many cases because of the value they attach to them, or even in an economic sense, the economic value attached to them. So the scaling back should be part of this. I think part of the problem is that we keep changing our expectations, and that even when you have the facts in front of you, it's hard to make a decision which isn't informed by personal, cultural, or social value.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways of thinking about scaling back. I mean, one of the other taboo things I'm really interested in is degrowth. I mean, that's anathema to U.S. capitalism, right? I mean, it's the economy, stupid. Like you can't even think about degrowth as a thing. But you know, there's all kinds of ways it makes sense, but we're not really pushing that. We're still thinking it has to be growth. This whole, which I think gets back to a lot of what we've talked about values and imagination within design. Like there are a lot of assumptions that I feel like as designers don't even test or go against because they're just so against the, like, I don't know, however you want to say it, capitalist values or, you know, extractive values. And our own, there was a question in our thing about vernacular, like our sort of capitalist vernacular that we have conditions us to not even think about those things. And I do think that things like degrowth don't get the airtime they need to be, you know, thought about and actually really brought into a design and planning investigation because they're so fringe at this point.
Yeah, Lizzie.
Yeah, maybe to kind of build on that and also the kind of the question itself, I think, you know, and to kind of springboard off the mention of Kianga's book, which looks at these two cases, the Rebuild by Design competition for New York City, and then the giant seawall project for Jakarta. And in both cases, these really, really major infrastructures for climate change adaptation are financed through a logic of growth, right? That there's always a kind of, in order to kind of get the cash to do these kind of big, especially when we envision adaptation as these kind of big engineering structures, and in a kind of neoliberal economy, the state's not going to pay that many $1 billion. So the logic is through real estate development. And so I think that also kind of gets to a scalar question about thinking about climate change, where at one scale, maybe you're making one space a little bit safer, potentially. I mean, I think we could even call into question some of the projects, which she does. But on the other hand, you know, maybe you're making one space safe while kind of just pumping more carbon into the atmosphere, perpetuating kind of certain lifestyles that are making adaptation or making the climate change issue worse. So I think that kind of is interesting in the context of design training also, because I think it asks us to think in the context of these projects always across scales. What are the ripple effects of the ways that we're designing within the site, beyond the site, and even at the global scale? And we can kind of no longer avoid kind of doing that zooming in and out, but from a climate and equity perspective.
So in a way, would I be right in understanding, Lizzie, that what you're talking about is how the climate change adaptation, the benefit that can come from that is offset or kind of neutralized by all the growth and development and kind of carbon release that needs to happen to pay for it. So in a way, it's a kind of resilience that's sort of empty because we're not actually changing anything. We're just finding a new equilibrium that allows the current unsustainable and fundamentally inequitable ways of living to continue.
I absolutely agree with that characterization, but it's not just these sort of, let's say, development level proposals for New York City or Rotterdam, et cetera. But also, you know, if we're going to talk about policy, I think we should say something about the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal, in my mind, is the largest project of environmental load displacement and American exceptionalism. I mean, I fully support, like the kind of good intentions of the kind of proposal. But what would be necessary to achieve what's stated in that document is pretty horrifying from a social and environmental justice point of view, right? Like there's a lot of the world would be suffering to make some Americans happy, and so I think we have to the scale question is, and the policy questions are super complicated, right? Because it's maybe the designers don't know, but maybe it's also the policymakers don't exactly know what what we should be doing. So it's fraught at all of these sorts of scales. That's why I appreciate the question about sort of scaling back. I think we do need to just slow the hell down and consume way less, and at least that gives us a little bit of space to think through what some of the right next steps forwards are. But in too many cases, our professions and disciplines are just kind of tweaking the old model as we continue on the same treadmill of consumption and waste, and we won't get there on that treadmill where we need to be.
So let me pick up another question from the chat. And, it wouldn't be an authentic 2021 Zoom webinar if I didn't bring the pandemic into it. But it's an interesting question, I think, because it does connect to this question of what can we do differently, but also how can we scale our actions and responses at different levels in different ways. And the question is, have members of the panel seen examples coming out of the pandemic of quick or forced change that we could potentially prolong or scale up to help in the fight against climate change? So are the things that we're doing differently now as a response to the pandemic that we want to keep doing and maybe even grow? Not traveling as much by airplane comes to mind, obviously, but I think we're looking for more profound insights.
Well, just on one front, I do think there's been the pandemic provided academics a little bit of headspace to rethink some aspects of education. You can't simply deliver this old model. I think that's very useful. I think it's been a push to kind of get more types of field work integrated into curricula. You have to get some, even though we're also important to get students out there, and I think that's been the challenge of that has been very compelling. So I think the opportunities to rethink pedagogy and kind of university frameworks and like how do you do research if you can't get to your lab, and those sorts of things I think have been actually fairly useful during the so-called crisis. But that's just one. I don't know if that's profound enough or if universities are acting on it. It seems like we snapped right back into the old model and the rush back to campus and charging students.
Danielle.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this fully answers the question, but I think one thing most certainly that the pandemic has revealed is that we all are overworked and that we're moving too fast all the time. And I think there are a lot of labor movements, especially that we're seeing right now in the US, lots of unions that are being formed or groups that are trying to form unions or could, come up in other ways, trying to, in the US right now, trying to advocate for paid maternity and paternity leave, for instance. These kinds of movements, I think, are extremely powerful because they're showing the holes in the current systems, the current ways of thinking. And I think these are the kinds of movements that we could start to latch onto and actually find traction to say, well, it's not just about our day-to-day, but if we think about our future, it's also being compromised because of the way that we're interacting with one another. The sort of capitalist systems that we're operating in right now are not just destructive to ourselves in the pandemic, but we're also try to connect that to climate change in some meaningful way. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I do see a lot of there's been a raised consciousness about the way that we're living and how that's not very sustainable, and the pandemic just exposed that. And I think we could take advantage of that.
Yeah, I sort of noticed the same thing. I felt like during the pandemic and when it was you know, perhaps the first half of it when we were first going into lockdown and everything, that people were just talking about more real things, and people were more vulnerable, and everybody was just a lot more real, and, you know, less focused on the lattes that they could no longer go get. And I don't know, I feel myself kind of, this is kind of a personal response, but I mean, I feel really frustrated with the push to go back into normalcy so quickly. And I feel like we are losing some of what was potentially, I don't know, dare I say, useful about the pandemic, of what brought us together, of what, you know, finding, you know, real stuff again, rather than, you know, it's kind of hard to get at these things. They're a little intangible, I feel, but I feel like we all had those experiences of, like, you know, people talking differently, people talking about their real stuff. And I think some of these, we've talked about values, like, I think that kind of came up. And as we push to get that economy back going again and doing everything as quickly as we can, I think we are bypassing some opportunities from that sort of reflection of that time.
I think, if I may, Brett, add to that, and I noticed a question or a statement in the chat, and it's always difficult, but, you know, the rush to go back to normality, what I find interesting over the last, you know, 2 years, and it's going to be different everywhere, but our horizons were lower. And I've spoken to people in my general area. They said, we discovered more about our local area over the last 2 years than we'd done before. And that's a really positive thing. And the other thing I think is really key, in a very short space of time, we all had to change our behavior. And people go, oh, getting people to change their behavior is really, really difficult. But actually, we all did change our behaviors. Now, obviously, some people have died, and there are a lot of negativities, but there's a lot of positivities about how people started to behave differently. And generally, in my experience, it was a very, very positive response that I witnessed.
I just wanted to follow up very briefly and talk about this idea of, so Christoph, you already referenced don't travel as much by plane. But I think during the pandemic, one of the things that struck me was that this kind of related industry to heritage, being tourism, was completely stopped. Nobody traveled for tourism. And what was interesting is exactly what Dusty was just saying, that we all discovered local ways of engaging with heritage and local forms of heritage. And through that, finding local communities that we didn't know existed. And that's one of the things that I really hope will remain, is that we don't fetishize international, global scale heritage, but actually we seek opportunities, and we keep seeking opportunities to engage with local heritage and local communities, which I think can help to start address some of the things that we've been discussing here. Some of the challenges. How do you get people to focus on community and local scale initiatives? Will you stop them from going somewhere else?
So I love all these sentiments, and I can certainly identify with some of them. But just to get back to the topic of social justice, which is in the title of our event, and to be a little bit contrarian, during the pandemic, for those of us who had the luxury, the ability to work from home and to work online, and who had the ability to rediscover our neighborhoods in an intimate and personal way, where there might be parks, where there might be little bookshops, where there might be cafes or community initiatives, fantastic. But of course, there are many parts of cities and many parts of the world where the experience of lockdown and the pandemic really highlighted what was not in your neighborhood. And I know this is taking us a little bit off topic, but we have such a fascinating group here. I want to ask you what your thoughts are on the 15-minute city. Because in a way, this whole debate, and Paris is one of the places that's really mobilizing the concept, for example, of the 15-minute city where you have all your local amenities and you can walk to everything, and it's very communal and it's very green. But that works if you have a real density, a concentration of amenities and so on. And if we start creating little mini 15-minute cities all across the world, we're also going to have lots of 30-minute, 40-minute, 60-minute cities that are deserts of all the things that we value in a neighborhood. So I don't know if there's a link to climate change and climate change adaptation, but it is a concept that worries me because it seems to be about concentrating privilege in a way that is almost exclusionary.
Well, it's a good idea, Christoph, the 15-minute whatever, but it has to be equitable. You know, we can't have places that don't have that. And therefore you need policies that says everything should be 15 minutes. And I think, you know, knowing some of my neighborhood well for 33 years, there's poor areas, there's wealthy areas, but a lot of the people I know who live in some of the poorer areas, you know, they actually discovered things and changed the way that they behave too. So I think the 15-minute city is a good idea, but it has to be for everybody. It can't just be for the elite. Because it is about climate change adaptation there, because you're not going to be consuming as much fuel. You know, you're going to be, you're going to be less consumptive to a certain extent.
So I don't want to stay too long with this topic because it's just it's my own personal pet fascination. But also, wouldn't this create a very different fundamental urban experience? So I think for lots of people, being in a city is about the diversity of the experience, the diversity of people, the diversity of spaces, and our ability to move through that. And the notion of the 15-minute city becoming hyper-local would be an interesting tension with the way that we conventionally experience urban space.
At the same time, I mean, it's like, of course, there's like, in some ways, no way to say no to that, but I think it can't come at the price of other things, other people. I think it's a kind of city-centric view of urbanization. You know, if we think about urbanization as a global, you know, extractive process, then if we're concentrating all of these resources so that a group of people have a 15-minute world, maybe that's fine, but there's going to be a lot of people without that, as has been said. So I think we need to be thinking about, caring about that kind of whole process of urbanization, from the extractive zones to these, you know, 15-minute concentrated zones of global capital. So I think I would just want to take a bigger view and understand the kind of, you know, values, how they're being transmuted all the way through that whole terrestrial process, and not just overprivilege, you know, one view, because that's maybe you know, I live in a rural context, so I'm very sensitive to how the impacts of some of those decisions have on you know, people who are pulling wood out of the ground or other things out of the ground, and it doesn't work out well for them in the normal sort of processes. Yeah,
that's sort of what I was thinking too, is the rurality question with that. I mean, I think I'm not super familiar with this idea, but I mean, it sounds a lot like what rural towns used to be before they were all emptied out and, you know, became subservient to large cities and all of those. And, you know, we have such a problem in the US between this polarity between rural communities and urban, you know, cities and things like that. So I agree with the last comment that, you know, there's a real I don't know, sort of urban age privileging in a lot of this that kind of ignores rurality. That's a problem.
Even though I'm in a very remote rural place, I still have less than a 15-minute to, you know, all the food with the local farmers, cheese, whatever I need is there. Building materials are all there. So I think I do share that, you know, view. It's possible, but we just, you know, it's not a city-centric question alone.
But I think also, if I may, because the city-centric, we might be making some assumptions. You know, certainly in my part of Southeast London, most of the people I know hardly ever go to central London. You know, London is a series of villages where people actually generally remain, other than going to work, within their neighborhood relatively. So there's an assumption that people who live in cities want to be moving around the city all the time. So I think, you know, I don't know whether that relates the same in a US city, because they've evolved slightly differently. But I think you find a lot of European cities, people generally stay in their neighborhoods unless they're going on holiday or they have to go to work.
So, sorry, I took us down the whole 15-minute city rabbit hole. But let's return a bit more to the topic of this panel. And before we run out of time, I would like to pick up on a question in the chat that I think is really interesting. And it's about your work as researchers, thinkers, scholars, practitioners. And the question is, you've shared a lot of insights and knowledge about climate change adaptation and the relationship with social justice, but how do you research and think about this topic? What are some of your methods, qualitative or quantitative, that you use to actually explore this relationship, climate change and social justice? Danielle.
Yeah, this is something I've given lots of thought to. I take a community science, a community-based approach to understanding these issues, mostly because I feel like if we look at the last 10 or 15 years, what's been produced on this topic, just climate change in general, we see many of the same cities, many of the same countries cropping up over and over again. And I think there is a lot of knowledge that we're not taking into account. I think one of the questions we had on our, that was posted to the panel was, about this connection between global north and global south. And I think we need to recognize that global south voices are not well included in these kinds of discussions, and that needs to start being addressed. And so for me, it's about unearthing those conversations, the knowledge, that those histories that aren't being listened to in these topics of climate change, especially when we start to talk about social justice or climate justice. And so trying to privilege that knowledge, how do we bring that into a space like the university, or peer-reviewed publications or books or whatever it is? How do we heighten that awareness of what some of these communities are facing? And what I've learned, even just from the communities in South Texas that I've been working with along the US-Mexico border, is incredible. Like the amount of knowledge they have that runs counter to some of the dominant theories that we have about even just how space works, especially when you're at the US-Mexico border, all the way up to an issue like climate change. And so I think that, to me, is really important, is how do we diversify the voices that we are responding to and listening to? How do we let them counter the theories that we've created? Because I think one thing we've unearthed in this panel is that some of the theories that we're proposing and holding as design scholars and professionals are actually not feasible in a lot of communities. It doesn't mean they're wrong. It's just perhaps they work better for certain cities, certain communities than others. And I think we need to have that nuance if we really want to address climate change from an equitable standpoint.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Yeah, first, I want to wholeheartedly support Danielle's method. I think that's super important, and I think kind of expanding who's at the table and who gets to decide, who gets to think about what are ways to design living with the environment and what are other ways to be with a climate threatened world are super, super important. I want to kind of add one of the methods that I've been adopting in my doctoral research, which is trying to kind of take some ethnographic methods, but to use them to kind of study ourselves, in that I'm kind of interested in using qualitative methods to understand how are the people who have been given the power traditionally to make decisions about how we do these kind of big interventions, to look at the tools that we've been using to kind of critically investigate, how is power embedded in those tools, who gets to wield them or not. I think for me has been really kind of revealing in terms of the ways that decisions get made and the kind of difference between the narratives that are told about projects and then the ways that kind of things happen behind the scenes. I think is maybe certainly not to replace the other kind of work, but as a kind of counterpoint for thinking about how power is acting in the way that these plans are being implemented.
Yeah, mine's sort of similar, I would say. Most of my research is applied design research, and I do try to stay close to home. I pretty much limit myself to California, trying to deepen my understanding and practice where I live, more or less, rather than dispersing myself elsewhere. And the way I work, I think, can easily is open for critique. I do sort of work from the inside out, where I often am a consultant to a lot of state agencies around water infrastructure and restoration, and I basically try to co-lead, co-design processes with communities that try to bring in these other voices, these other values. So it's not just the water and the ecology, but it's like, how are these things affecting communities? How can we benefit these communities? How can we bring more value to them? If you're going to radically change these landscapes and things, how do we also build in for them and their values? So I'm sort of committed to, I guess, what I call transdisciplinary co-design processes and trying to advance them. They're not perfect. I learn from each one I do, but to really, I think really trying to get at this multiplicity of values, pluralism in a landscape that it's going to mean multiple things to multiple people. There's no singular landscape out there, and trying to accommodate that to the degree we can. That's what I'm trying to work with at this point.
One of the maybe interesting approaches that we've taken, again, from a physical science perspective, is citizen science. So engaging people in the act of climate adaptation. So in this particular example, we've had a project ongoing for a few years that actually looks at remote heritage sites in Scotland and gets people to help us monitor them. This in itself was originally primarily motivated by collecting scientific data for scientific hypotheses, but along the way has been fascinating in itself, raising awareness of the challenges and also kind of making science a more democratic and inclusive process. And kind of as a third unexpected outcome, also helping us to understand people's perspectives, people's values and what they prioritize and the things that they find important about what is being advertised and is rightfully part of their heritage as well. So I think citizen science approaches are fantastic in both tackling it as a physical challenge for the built environment, but also as a social challenge.
I described a little bit of my research methods in the intro, but I just want to plug an important starting point for me and my research group is that, starting with the ignorance-based worldview, that we have to instrumentalize what we don't know as much as what we might know or have access to knowing is really important. And I think we heard versions of that this afternoon. That we don't know what the answers are, what the solutions are, and so we have to have some other methods. But certainly not the kind of machismo of knowing is not necessarily the right place to start with. So ignorance-based worldview, I think, is a good starting point for a lot of our research projects.
And Dusty, anything you would share about your methods?
Yeah, well, I'm not really a researcher, but because I'm quite embedded in my particular industry, what I'm trying to do, and some of the work that I've been trying to do at UCL, is to look at new models of delivering, particularly retrofitting, that are not as linear as the construction industry normally wants everything to be. And that involves hopefully creating jobs for local people, and that they can be actively involved in the delivery of retrofittable green roofs in London, and to create a replicable model which could be replicated anywhere. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm always trying to push those boundaries since I started being an activist.
Sounds like research to me.
Yeah, it's kind of not what I think of as research, but it's quite challenging,
So thank you all for sharing those insights into how you work. And I'm really moved by the way in which each of you has expressed a certain humility towards the challenges that you're confronting. And to me, it actually creates a lot of optimism for what we in universities and in the design professions can contribute towards climate change adaptation and creating more social justice, because it seems that a thread running through all of your replies is understanding that we don't have all the knowledge and being willing to share and activate many voices, lots of epistemologies, multiple geographies. To me, it's such a refreshing way of thinking about what experts contribute to a field. It's not about hitting communities with knowledge and expertise and solutions, but rather about teasing out and together collaboratively co-creating those solutions. And so I wonder, I mean, do you share that sense of optimism? It seems to me that we have a very international group of people, and obviously not all regions of the world are represented in our panel, and not all voices are present on our panel, but it's fascinating that across your different departments and disciplines and geographies, there is this thread that connects how you're all approaching the existential challenge of climate change.
Well, a lot's happened in the 25 years that I've been doing what I've been doing. So I'm always half full. So I can only assume that the next 25 years, some of the positive things will speed up. But I think we're going to have to go a lot faster than I suspect we will. So my half full becomes slightly half empty.
So we're coming towards the end of our time. So if there's any concluding remarks, any last insights people want to share, this is a moment for that. Okay. We've been at it for an hour and a half. We've had well over 120 and more people joining us online. We've covered a lot of topics, and I really want to thank our audience for joining us. I want to thank Places Journal for co-organizing, co-hosting this event together with the Bartlett. And most of all, I really want to thank our panelists for sharing all of their thoughts and participating in this conversation together. I've learned a lot. I have a lot to go away and think about and things to read and look up. And I'm just really grateful to all of you for making a time available, and even fun to see various pets jumping into the frame in various households as well. So that's a fun part of the evening. So thank you, everybody. Great to have you together for the conversation. And let's keep finding ways to connect and share what we do in the different spaces in which we live and work.